All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, that was great. Welcome to the 2025 Philip A. Hart Memorial Lecture. I would like to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guest, Professor Deborah Archer. We're very excited to have you join us here today. Sure. Yeah. I just want to start by saying a few words about the lecture itself. The Philip A. Hart Memorial Lectureship was established at Georgetown Law by the family and friends of Philip A. Hart, a distinguished U.S. Senator and alumnus of Georgetown University. Senator Hart was known as the conscience of the Senate for his leadership in several important areas in which he stood by his convictions even when it risked his own political career. Hart led efforts to promote integration, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for which he was a floor manager. He championed the end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and defended the average worker against big business interests. A member of the greatest generation, Hart suffered injuries during the D-Day invasion in Normandy, France, and was awarded a Purple Heart, among other honors for his distinguished service. This lecture has become a highlight of the Law Center calendar. For more than 2 decades, we have brought a prominent scholar or professional to deliver a lecture at Georgetown Law on topics that were dear to Senator Hart in an effort to honor the conscience of the Senate and to promote the principles he championed. In recent years, we've had the privilege of hosting Professor Mary Sarah Bilder, the Honorable Guido Calabresi, and the Honorable Ann Claire Williams. And today, we will hear from another luminary, Professor Deborah N. Archer. But first, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor Kevin Arlick, our Associate Dean for Research and Academic Programs. Professor Arlick teaches in civil procedure, federal courts, and legal history. His scholarship focuses on the early history of the federal judiciary, particularly its role in shaping national governance between the ratification of the Constitution and the Civil War. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in leading journals, including Law and History Review, Columbia Law Review, NYU Law Review, Notre Dame Law Review, and BYU Law Review. He also recently published The Nation at Sea, a book about the influential role of the federal courts in early U.S. foreign relations. Before joining the faculty at Georgetown, Professor Arlick clerked for Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the U.S. Supreme Court and for Judge Robert Katzman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He previously held academic fellowships at Columbia Law School and NYU Law School and practiced law at Orrick Harrington in New York. And now, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Kevin, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Josh. So I'll say we are really honored to be celebrating, to continue to celebrate Philip Hart's legacy in this series. And so with that in mind, it's my great pleasure to introduce Deborah Archer, a distinguished scholar, advocate, and public interest leader whose work has profoundly impacted how we understand civil rights law and the built environment. So a few things about Professor Archer. She's a graduate of Smith College and Yale Law School. She began her career clerking for Judge Alvin Thompson of the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut. After clerking, she worked as a civil rights litigator with both the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she litigated in areas like voting rights, employment discrimination, and school desegregation. Professor Archer currently serves as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She became the ACLU's president in 2021 and is the first person of color to hold that role in the organization's history since its founding over 100 years ago. Professor Archer is also the Margaret B. Hoppin Professor of Law, and she serves as the faculty director of the Community Equity Initiative at New York University Law School. Go Violets. This is a program that pursues advocacy, advises leaders, advances policies, and convenes thinkers to help marginalized communities access equal opportunity. And if all of that wasn't enough, Professor Archer also directs NYU's Civil Rights and Racial Justice Clinic, which provides students the opportunity to work on a wide range of matters that promote and protect civil rights and community equity. And through her work, Professor Archer bridges scholarship, teaching, and community-engaged advocacy. So her contributions to advancing racial and social justice have earned her numerous honors, including election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, induction in the American Law Institute, the Smith College Medal, and the William Robert Ming Advocacy Award from the NAACP. You'd think I'd stop here, but no, Professor Archer is also a distinguished scholar. She's the author of a number of articles published in journals you might have heard of, including the NYU Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review, and the University of Chicago Law Review, just to name a few. Her 2020 article in the Vanderbilt Law Review, titled White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction, earned her the John Hope Franklin Prize Honorable Mention from the Law and Society Association. And most relevant, her most recent book, Dividing Lines: How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality, has been met with wide acclaim. For one example, Publishers Weekly called it well-researched and disturbing, a vital contribution to the literature on modern-day inequality in America. This book has sparked a national conversation about how our cities are built and whom they serve, with features in outlets like The Atlantic and the New York Times. So Professor Archer brings together and brings to us, for which we're eternally grateful, her decades of civil rights litigation experience and rigorous scholarship to offer what I think is a transformative vision for how infrastructure policy can be a driver of equity rather than division. And we are truly honored to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Archer.
Thank you. Thank you to Dean Teitelbaum and Dean Arlick for that very generous introduction. At a certain point, I was like, oh, I did that? I forgot all about that. But thank you for the generous introduction and for inviting me here to give a lecture in honor of Senator Hart that stood up for racial justice and access to opportunity, just despite incredible headwinds. And I think it is reflective of a lot of what's going on today and what I hope to talk about as well. And I'm also happy to be here at Georgetown because I have so many friends on the law faculty, and it has been lovely to see long-term friends and new friends and folks who I have looked up to their work for a very, very long time. So again, thank you all for inviting me to be here to talk about my own work. You can imagine that in these times when I go to speak someplace, they want to hear about the ACLU, and I want to talk about highways. And so I was invited to talk about highways, and I'm so very excited about that. But I imagine that after I give my remarks and we step over for a conversation and we engage with you all for questions, that things will take a different turn, and I welcome all of the discussion. So when I was thinking about how to address you all, I reflected on a convening that I participated at recently at the Ford Foundation that was about monuments. And we've had a national conversation in this country, or more accurately, a national fight about monuments for quite some time, about what they represent, who they honor, who they erase. And too often that conversation, I think, has focused on statues. The Confederate general in the town square or the colonizer looming over the park. And those symbols absolutely matter, and it's important that they've been the focus of conversation. They tell us who continues to be celebrated and who continues to be silenced. And they remind us that monuments, commemorations are not neutral. They are choices about memory, about power, and about belonging. But monuments are far more than just statues. They're also about the landscape that we have built and the public goods that we deny to certain groups and certain communities. They are also the underfunded public school that left generations of Black children without the resources that they needed to thrive and access opportunity. It's the hospitals that were never built in Black communities with impacts on health, the absence of grocery stores and green spaces in those same communities, the faulty water infrastructure that instead of providing nutrition and good health, poison communities. Those are monuments, living monuments that testify to whose lives are important whose lives matter, whose lives are invested in, what communities we invest in. And these monuments help map racism into place. And that makes sense to me because racism is about place on multiple levels. In my mind, white supremacy depends on Black people and other people of color knowing their place within the social hierarchy and then staying there. And one of the most effective and powerful means that white supremacy has of ensuring that Black people knew their place socially was to keep them in their place physically, to pen them in, to constrain their movement and limit the places that they had access to, the places where they could live and work and play and rest. So my research and my book take a closer look at the role of transportation infrastructure in that system. Highways, bridges, rail lines, they may not seem like monuments, but I think they tell a similar and every bit as powerful story. Transportation, as I'm sure you all know, is far more than a means of moving people back and forth. Transportation systems shape who is allowed to feel like they belong. It helps determine who has access to opportunity. Transportation infrastructure is the infrastructure of high-quality education. It's the infrastructure of access to good health and economic opportunity. Transportation infrastructure is the infrastructure of a multiracial democracy. And so although it's not directly the work that the ACLU focuses on and thrives on, it's important to everything we do because nothing that we fight for is ever going to be achieved if we don't attend to the impact that transportation infrastructure has on that work. And it's also central to the story of civil rights. I don't think you can tell the story of America's second Reconstruction without mentioning the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, or the freedom riders who tested the right to interstate travel, or the protesters who took to the streets and marched across bridges to demand the right to vote. Black freedom fighters have long fought for the right to equitably use transportation, but they've also used transportation infrastructure as a platform to make their demands heard because they knew that these monuments were not only symbolic, they were functional. They worked to confine, to segregate, and to channel people either towards or away from opportunity. So when interstates were deliberately routed through thriving Black neighborhoods and when transit investments were steered away from communities of color, those decisions carved racism into the physical map of our nation. Those decisions didn't just move cars, they uprooted families, they destroyed businesses, they fractured the social and economic networks and fabric of a community, and the scars are still visible today in neighborhoods that are left distant from opportunity, isolated from jobs and resources, in communities where the asthma rates are so high because of the expressways that run through them, and in schools that are cut off from opportunity. So our infrastructure has functioned as a living monument to white supremacy, shaping daily life and opportunity. And in my book, I argue driving racial segregation, one of the factors that drove racial segregation. Because when we expand our understanding of government-sponsored segregation beyond racial covenants and redlining, which we're all very familiar with, it's clear that it's not just these invisible lines that create the inequality and the division that we see, but also the physical, literal lines that run through our communities that may seem innocuous or natural or inevitable. Those are as much the architecture of racial inequality. And that's a story I tell in Dividing Lines, that as legal segregation began to crumble because of the success of the civil rights movement, cities across America started turning to infrastructure as a more permanent and more visible way to enforce racial hierarchy. So in many ways, infrastructure was one of the tools that replaced Jim Crow. So ultimately, it's a book about how racism adapts and evolves and found its way into zoning laws and city planning. But before I go into more details, I want to explain why my book and my talk today focuses on Black people and Black communities. Of course, although many groups were impacted by transportation infrastructure, many communities were damaged by transportation infrastructure and policy, and have stories to tell, I think Black people have had a unique experience that is worth telling on its own. And this stems from multiple causes. The first is the distinctive historical relationship between Black people and transportation that began during slavery and continued to evolve to today. It's also true that the intentional racial discrimination that has driven transportation infrastructure development in Black communities is somewhat unique. And then we have the layering of transportation infrastructure on top of decades of discriminatory housing laws and policies and practices that were also uniquely directed towards Black people. And it's the stark second-class status of Black Americans that persists in other areas of American life today. And then also I think that if you try to tell everyone's story, then you don't tell anyone's story. And so this is the story that I've decided to tell, completely acknowledging that there are other stories that deserve being told as well, and I hope that other folks will tell those stories. So the story I'm telling. As we saw the judicial decisions and civil rights laws of the 1950s and 1960s make it more difficult to isolate Black communities using zoning laws and other regulations, urban planners turned to public transportation, to highways, to city planning techniques. And I think it really hit a peak following the decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And I know this audience all knows what Brown versus Board of Education is. Supreme Court decision that said separate educational facilities by race is unconstitutional. And so Brown certainly signaled the fall of legally segregated public education. But Brown also signaled the fall of segregation writ large because it undermined the foundation of Plessy versus Ferguson. And so in response to Brown, we saw people around the country proclaiming that they were going to do everything that they could to protect their way of life. And in the years following Brown, we saw what was called massive resistance. They showed the sacrifices that they were willing to make. They closed down schools, made school attendance optional. When they were looking at integrating pools, they closed public pools, they closed down movie theaters because they did not want to integrate, they wanted to resist change. And so at the same time that they were doing this, they started talking about infrastructure and building the interstate highway system. So the conversation around the interstate highway system began at the same time that massive resistance was in full swing. And it hit a peak in 1956 when over 100 legislators, federal legislators, signed an agreement, this called the Southern Manifesto, where they agreed to use everything that they had to fight integration. And that was signed in 1956. 2 months later, those same legislators signed the Interstate Highway Act into law. And rather than build the interstate highway system against the promise of Brown of bringing people together, they built it with that resistance, that focus on resisting integration, holding on to the past and fighting the future. They used that to inspire so many pieces of the interstate highway. One example that I talk about is Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham during this time was known as Bombingham because as Black folks started to move away from their segregated communities into white communities, the folks in Birmingham turned to the most traditional tool to resist integration, and that was racial violence. And so as Black folks bought homes, they were often bombed before they could even move into those homes. Happened so frequently, they became known as Bombingham. But one other tool that they used to enforce segregation were racial zoning laws. And racial zoning laws drew lines on a map and said, Black people could live over here in this zone, white people could live in this zone, and you cannot live in a zone not designated for your race. And when racial zoning laws were struck down in the 50s, the folks who were building the interstate highway through Birmingham turned to the highway. And if you overlay the racial zoning boundaries in Birmingham, they mirror exactly where the highway was built through these Black communities. So they, of course, destroyed and uprooted the Black community, but they also turned the invisible racial zoning boundary into a physical boundary that was a physical and psychological boundary that helped to maintain segregation. A similar thing happened in Atlanta. Atlanta also used racial zoning laws. And when those zoning laws were struck down, members of the white community went to the mayor and other local leaders and said, we need you to protect us from black migration, and we need you to use the highway to do that. And the mayor agreed. And so if you look at I-20, I-20 mirrors the racial zoning boundaries through Atlanta. And there were points at which public planners even said to them, this highway to make any sense at all, you need to make some shifts. And the mayor said, no, I promised white people that I would protect them. And so it has to stay where it is. Another example, another way that it worked, I talk about is in Indianapolis. And in Indianapolis, in downtown, they have two highways that intersect, I-65 and I-70. And Indianapolis is one of the communities that used redlining. And I also know you all know what redlining is, drawing lines around communities and say, you don't get any economic investment. You're not going to get a mortgage. You're not going to get a loan to repair your home. And the result, of course, was the degradation of that community. And then what many cities did was use that kind of economic downturn in those communities as an excuse to build the highways through them. So if you look at the intersection of I-65 and I-70 in downtown Indianapolis, 90% of it goes through the red-line communities. So that it takes twists and turns to avoid the other communities and to stay only within red-lined communities. And as I learned during my research is that basically every state has a similar story to tell about a highway that destroyed a black community. And of course, the interstate was not built on a blank slate. It went right through developed communities. We talk about them being slums and rundown communities, but in fact, they were economically vibrant communities. So many of them were known as the Wall Street of X state or as the Harlem of the South. And they were destroyed because of this desire, this intent to remove black communities and to build this wall and this barrier. One estimate by the United States Department of Transportation says that 500,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide as a direct result of the original construction of the highways. Of course, we know that as highways continued to be built and rebuilt, that more and more people were damaged. But in addition to that, millions of other people were left in hollowed out communities after the bulldozers finished their work, and the neighborhood were destroyed and the families were forced to move. And those families couldn't move to the white suburbs that were now being connected to cities through these highways because they weren't allowed to live in those growing white suburbs because of discrimination. Those people had to move to already deeply segregated communities that were already overtapped in terms of housing and public infrastructure. And so it deepened the kind of economic divide and the physical divide. And of course, it didn't just take homes, but taking homes is important. It was the core of wealth. It still is, for many people, the core of their wealth. But the highway also took businesses and schools, community institutions, and destroyed the fabric in that way. And those communities and their residents, of course, bear the marks of decades of accumulated disadvantage. And I don't argue, of course, that the highway caused all the problems that urban communities face, because of course it didn't. It's a complicated story. But that construction did compound discrimination, exclusion, and exploitation and created boundaries, physical, economic, and psychological. And although the highways are the ones that people are most familiar with, they're not the only way that transportation infrastructure was co-opted to further segregation, division, and oppression. In the book, I talk about roads. And like the nation's interstate highway system, there are roads that were built specifically to remove black communities or to form a barrier. But what we also saw were governmental powers deployed under the guise of urban planning and street safety to build roads and street grids that were designed to maintain that segregation, but also to keep people separate, to make it very difficult to move physically from a black community to a white community. And I wonder, I'm going to talk about Atlanta. Anybody here from Atlanta? All right, I'm so sorry. I'm going to target y'all because y'all are extra, right? Y'all stay doing the most always. Atlanta was in a league of its own. Atlanta called itself the city too busy to hate, but they lied because they found the time and they used every resource they could. It was like they were obsessed with finding ways to maintain separate white and black communities. So Atlanta would use a series of one-way streets to make sure that you only could move from white communities away from white communities to black communities, but you couldn't move from the black communities to the white communities. And a study now shows that some of the traffic challenges that Atlanta faces is because they have so many one-way streets all going in the same direction, right, away from white communities. Atlanta also would dead end through streets or turn through streets into cul-de-sacs to make it difficult to move from black communities to white communities. Atlanta did something very interesting and unique. They would change the name of the street. When there was a through street that went from into a black community and a white community, they would change the name as the racial character of the neighborhood changed to, I guess, save black, white folks the indignity of having to say they lived on the same street as white folks, but also it helped you know the racial character of the neighborhood by the street name. And only today, in the last few years, has Atlanta started to take steps to unify the names of those streets. Atlanta has something that they did on Willis Mills Road that is still visible today. Willis Mills Road, at one end was a black community, and at the other end was a white community. And the white community wanted to make sure you could not easily travel from the black community to the white community. So Atlanta abandoned a large portion of the street, just dug up the pavement. They didn't take care of it. They allowed it to grow over. And still today, there are two disconnected pieces of Willis Mills Road because they wanted it to be hard to get from one community to the next. And then Atlanta used what became known as segregation walls. And one example on Peyton Road became known as Atlanta's Berlin Wall. And this was in the 60s. A black surgeon from Morehouse College lived in the black community at one end of a street and moved down the street to the white community. And the white community was upset, and they went to the mayor and said, you've got to stop it, make it so that they can't come through and to our community, just end it. And the mayor built a wall in the middle of the street to create a physical divide. And of course, folks protested that wall. It was built of wood, so at one point it was burned down. When it was burned down, the city rebuilt it, and then the Ku Klux Klan, dressed in full regalia, would guard the wall 24 hours a day, holding up signs that said, white people have rights too. And that barricade stood for almost 80 days before members of the black community had to sue and were able to get a federal judge to order that that wall be taken down. A similar situation happened in Memphis, and I read about this when I was in law school, a case called Memphis versus Green that some of you all might be familiar with. And this was in the 80s. The city of Memphis decided to block West Drive, which was a main thoroughfare that connected a black community and a white community. And black folks would drive down West Drive to get to the city center and the park that was at the opposite end, on the other side of the white community. And white communities, the white community decided that they didn't want what they called undesirable influences driving through their community. And so they got the city to close off the road, to build a barricade right at the line that divided the black community and the white community. And it wasn't a part of a citywide effort. It was just this one street was blocked off in support of one community and at the expense of another. And this case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that this was just a slight inconvenience to the black motorists, that they could still get downtown, they could still get to the park, they just had to drive around, and so that wasn't a big deal. And they also said that the consequences that they're feeling are not because they're black, it's because of where they live. And they ignore the reality that in the United States, you can't separate those things. Luckily, Justice Marshall was on the court because representation matters. And he dissented and was able to get two other justices to join with him. And he pointed out that any analysis that focuses on the extra minutes that are added or the miles that are added or subtracted from a commute ignores what was really at heart, and that's the plain and clear message of who matters. It's a message that was sent to both members of the white community and a message that was sent to the members of the black community as well. And of course, it's still happening today. For the past 5 years, I've represented a black community in Sand Ridge, in South Carolina. It's in the county of Conway. And Conway is building a road that will help connect a new white suburb to Myrtle Beach. And they want to make it fast so people can get to the beach fast and enjoy recreation. And they had 4 possible routes to build this road. And all routes were through Sand Ridge. and we're going to destroy this historical Black community that was founded by sharecroppers who found a way to support each other and build a community in the face of really unimaginable and unthinkable violence and discrimination. One example that I find it still troubles me. There is the developer who built this white suburb also had a vacant plot of land. And on that plot of land, he planned to build a storage facility. And in order to save his storage facility, his future storage facility, and this vacant plot of land, the road takes a big turn that goes around his vacant land and takes 5 more homes of elderly Black folks who have lived in Sandridge their entire life. So of course, we're not talking about tens of thousands of people losing their homes. It's going to be 20 homes that are going to be taken. But it still has an impact, 20 homes in a small community. People are going to lose their families, their connections, their neighbors, their support. They're going to take a school and a park. And of course, the people who live there are going to have to live with the impact of a major roadway coming right through their backyard. And so today we're still fighting roads that are targeting Black and brown communities. And of course, there's public transportation. We all know the stories of the way that public transportation evolved under a cloud of explicit racism that has now morphed into more dog whistle policies that lean into the false narrative of excessive Black criminality and the guise of safety. And so the result is transportation deserts in Black communities from a lack of investment, and transportation deserts in white communities because they want to keep out the people who use that public transportation. And one example I think that's particularly salient is around buses, because buses carry a particular racial and cultural stigma. In 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation on public buses violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the decision, of course, led to the famous Montgomery bus boycott, but also helped code buses as Black. And the day after the decision, an article ran in a local paper predicting that the decision would lead either to the end of bus service in southern cities or to white citizens abandoning the bus system entirely. And to some extent, I think that both have actually happened. In Georgia in the 1990s, Cobb County was fighting, again, Georgia and Atlanta. I told you, was fighting the extension of public transportation and bus stops that would connect Cobb County to Atlanta. And former Congressman and Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich came to their defense. And he said, quote, "People in Cobb County don't object to upper middle class neighbors who keep their lawn cut and move to the area to avoid crime. But what people worry about is the bus line gradually destroying one apartment complex after another, bringing people out from public housing who have no middle class values and whose kids, as they become teenagers, are the centers of robbery, and where the schools collapse because the parents who live in the apartment complexes don't care that the kids don't do well in school, and the whole school system collapses." He never mentioned race once in that quote, but it was all about race. And although it wasn't a bus system, I found similar sentiments were expressed in the opposition of the efforts to connect the Red Line, connecting Baltimore to the suburbs. And I found one transcript where someone said, you can't connect the Red Line to our community because then people from Baltimore will jump on the Red Line, come to our communities, rob us, take our TVs, and then jump back on the Red Line. Because everyone in here who teaches crim law or studies crim law knows the best way to escape is to put the TV under your arm and get on public transportation, right? But buses have a particular focus. So in my research, I learned about the death of a 17-year-old Black woman named Cynthia in Buffalo, New York in the 1990s. She worked at a fast food restaurant in an upscale suburban mall. And to get to the mall from the nearest bus stop, she had to race across 7 lanes of traffic because the mall wouldn't let the city bus, which was used mostly by Black folks, into the parking lot. They let a commuter bus in there, they let tour buses in there, but they wouldn't let the city bus in there. And one day, as Cynthia was making the run to get to work, she was struck by a dump truck and killed. And it is a story that I think repeats all too often about Black people needing to access jobs that are increasingly in the suburbs, and those white communities doing everything they can to keep those people from accessing that economic opportunity. A more recent example that I talk about in the book from 2010 is in Beaver Creek, Ohio. And Beaver Creek is a suburb located about 15 minutes east of Dayton, Ohio. And people there, again, work in a suburban mall in Beaver Creek and come from Dayton via bus. But Beaver Creek wouldn't let any bus stops in Beaver Creek. And so the closest bus stop was about 2 miles from the mall. And people would have to take the bus to that last bus stop, and then they would walk the rest of the way to the mall. Half of that stretch, for long periods, didn't have any sidewalk at all. No traffic calming measures. And about a mile of it was an overpass over I-675. And that overpass didn't have sidewalks, didn't have crosswalks. Again, no traffic calming measures. And it was dangerous on any normal day, but worse so at night or in the snow or the wind or when it was raining. And Beaver Creek said, that's too bad. You can come and work for us, do what we need to do, but we're not going to encourage you or your people to come here and be a part of our community. So folks in Dayton organized. They were able to push Beaver Creek to get bus stops. Beaver Creek said, nope, we are responsible for our people, and our people don't want you here. They don't want our mall turning into the Dayton Mall, which is where the Black and brown folks shopped. So organizers in Dayton were able to convince the federal government to come in and try to push Beaver Creek to do something different. And Beaver Creek said, fine, we will add bus stops on a few conditions. First, we need state-of-the-art surveillance cameras that provide full coverage 24 hours a day that feeds directly from the bus stops into the police department. Second, we need a list of behaviors that are allowed and not allowed, rules and regulations, which of course would then be used to police and target the people who use that bus stop. Beaver Creek also said they needed an 18-inch concrete pad at every bus stop. And I later learned that an 18-inch concrete pad is what you need if a plane lands, not if a bus stops. And then really surprisingly, Beaver Creek said that every bus stop needed to be fully air-conditioned and fully heated. And at that point, the only fully air-conditioned bus stop in the world was in Dubai, right? So none of it was about comfort of the riders. It was all about keeping out Black folks. And I'm happy to say that the folks in Dayton were successful in pushing, with the help of the federal government, pushing Beaver Creek to add half the number of bus stops that they had requested. And the mall is still fine. It has not, right? It has not imploded. It's all good. And then finally, the book talks about sidewalks. When I told people I was going to include a chapter about sidewalks in the book, they were like, it'll be 3 pages long. And I thought maybe it'll be 3 pages long, but I came to learn that although we may never think about sidewalks at all, they are an important part of the history of transportation inequality. They have really been an effective tool for making and shoring up those racial hierarchies that I was talking about earlier. So first, there's the historical aspect. Sidewalks have always been contested space, and people navigated them together out of necessity. And during slavery, Black city residents, both free and enslaved, had the greater freedom of movement than their siblings who were held on plantations in more rural areas. So urban Black residents regularly shared the streets and sidewalks with white folks. And so that relative freedom and that proximity prompted rules and regulations. So first, there were codes that spoke to who could use the sidewalk, when they could use the sidewalk, who had to step off the sidewalk. And then that evolved into Jim Crow etiquette that was unofficial, that required Black people to yield to white people when walking. And white people were granted the inner side of the sidewalk, which was deemed to be safer, cleaner, away from puddles and the cars and things that were passing. And that became known as giving whites the wall, or the white man's right of way. And today, many Black parents have a conversation with their children about how to navigate if you encounter the police and how to come out of that safely, and they call it the talk. And I spoke with many folks who said that when they were growing up in the Jim Crow South, the talk included how to navigate interactions with white people on the sidewalks so that you would be able to come home safe and with your life. And to this day, that legacy of Jim Crow is still felt in formerly segregated cities. After city planners destroyed Black communities with highways and major roadways, they then ignored how we are going to navigate our own communities. How could the people who live there get from point A to B safely in their own communities? And so we have Black communities now where the sidewalks are not well maintained. Studies show that lots of Black communities have a little piece of sidewalk, and then there is a mile with no sidewalk, and then another little piece of sidewalk. Or they have sidewalks that are not navigable. And in the book, I talk about a very well-known example involving Michael Brown, because of course, rather than responding to the lack of economic investment in pedestrian infrastructure in Black and brown communities, we respond in the way that we always do, with policing and punishment. And so we over-enforce pedestrian infrastructure laws. Michael Brown started his day walking in the street in Ferguson, a community that was known to have unusable sidewalks. Community advocates had been asking and fighting for decades to have usable sidewalks. And so he was walking in the street because you couldn't walk on the sidewalk. He was stopped by the police. And of course, you know that ended in his death. The police wanted to ticket him for walking in the street. And the book talks about other examples, a man in Louisiana who uses a wheelchair, but couldn't use the wheelchair on the sidewalks in his community because they were so destroyed. And he was stopped for walking in the street, for using the street to navigate with his wheelchair. Another woman, also in Louisiana, who was stopped for walking in the street because the sidewalks were so broken, and was beaten mercifully by the police and injured and ended up in the hospital. And all that because we won't invest in pedestrian infrastructure in Black and brown communities to make it safe for people to navigate their own communities. And of course, all of this is a story about the law. I think part of the nefarious genius in using highways and roads and public transportation and pedestrian infrastructure to cement racial inequality was the belief that those pieces of infrastructure would outlive and outlast existing laws that helped facilitate segregation and new laws that would be developed to fight segregation. And they were right to a large extent. I think the racialization of public transportation shows some of the weaknesses in our civil rights laws. Those laws have beautiful sweeping language that should be able to reach some of these decisions, but they don't. And for a variety of reasons, it's a complicated ball and puzzle. But some of the things that we can think about is that our civil rights laws often most regularly apply after a decision has been made. And in transportation infrastructure, it's all about being a part of the decision making, because once you have decided a route, it is very hard to turn that ship around. Our civil rights laws put the burden of proof on members of an impacted community rather than on government agencies that have the knowledge and the resources. They know what they did. It's hard for us to figure out what they did. Our civil rights laws are applied against a legal backdrop that focuses on intent and identifying bad actors and ignores structural and systemic concerns. So of course, I told a story about how intent was woven into these infrastructure decisions, intentional racial discrimination, but it has evolved, and it is hard to identify a one actor or one decision. It's hard to identify the intentional discrimination because it is such a complicated system. And because the discrimination is there in part because it's being built on this foundation of inequality that we treat as a neutral baseline. And of course, it's easy for public officials to explain away what they're doing because our courts give undue deference to their purported reasons for what they're doing. And I looked at many court cases that showed that no matter what evidence Black folks came up with to show that it was intentional discrimination, the court would accept the excuse of the public officials, even if it made no sense in light of the record. And as I said before, race continues to really be a powerful and frequently used tool to sort physical space and guide public policy, and our law struggles to address that. The book doesn't have a list of solutions. I don't have any fixes to the problem. Instead, I focus on getting us to think differently and to explore what thinking differently means. I'm trying to get policymakers to understand the trade-offs that we're making, there always will be trade-offs. But the problem is that the trade-offs are always done on the backs of the same communities. Same communities are forced to host all the negative and get the benefit of very few of the policies. Our history shows that we're willing to sacrifice Black communities, Black people, Black bodies, and Black wealth to get things built that we all need. And that trade-off doesn't work for me. That trade-off doesn't work for Sand Ridge or so many other communities, and we need to do things differently. And this is a wonderful opportunity. It's a time to do this rethinking, the time to have these conversations. Our infrastructure is crumbling. It's aging. A lot of it has outlived its useful life. Pieces of highways are dropping to the floor. We've seen bridges collapse. So we have to think about how we do things differently. And we built our way into this crisis. We have to build our way out of this crisis. And as we rebuild, we have a choice whether to exacerbate the harms of the past by continuing to build in the same fashion and targeting the same people, or we can choose a new path that is going to help connect communities to each other and to opportunity, and to really build back better for everyone. So thank you for listening to a story about transportation infrastructure. I look forward to your questions.
Are these on? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
So Deborah, thank you. That was amazing. And I just want to say on a personal note, I listened to part of the book on audiobook. I read the rest of the book.
Were you disappointed that it wasn't me on audiobook? My niece and nephew were.
No, now I really am. Because it was incredibly powerful to listen to and to read, but to hear you talk about it is all the more powerful. And I mean, this is in some ways not a fun book to read, but listening to you talk about it is enjoyable. Your ability to bring a sense of humor to what is not a funny subject at all is really amazing. So thank you for joining us. It's a different thing to hear you talk about it even than just to read it.
Well, I will say, like, I try to bring joy to all of my work because that helps us get through the day, right? It's this work is challenging, it is hard, it is depressing and demoralizing, but we have to still wake up every day and approach it with joy and optimism. So I try.
Oh, well, you really succeeded. So we have time for some questions. As is typical of law professors, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to ask the first question, but then I'm going to cold call on some people in the audience who made the mistake of submitting questions online, right, and will be asked to share their terrific questions. So I wanted to start off with something that you ended with, right, where you talked about how this system that we have now is not simply a legacy of individual bad apples making racist choices, right? That there's a deep structural and institutional component to the racial inequality in transportation infrastructure. But in the book, I was struck by how many examples you have of bad apples making, I mean, Atlanta, right? It's just like expressly racist choices about transportation infrastructure. So that this is an area where we don't necessarily, if we're thinking about the difference between discriminatory intent and discriminatory effects. Right. Discriminatory intent is all over the place. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more in the context of transportation infrastructure, how you think about the interaction between, let's call it personal racism and structural racism, right? And how they maybe feed each other, right? Depend on each other, however you conceive of that relationship.
We talk about them as completely separate things, but they are obviously not completely separate things. And so any decision, whether it be in transportation infrastructure, in housing and education, in the criminal legal system, we can see this kind of weaving of individual racist decisions and the way that seemingly neutral decisions interact with our history and structures that were founded on past racism. And I think part of the challenge in telling the story of it as currently as just intentional racism is no one wants to, even in this day and age, in this day, it's still hard to convince people that individual decisions are racist because people intended them to be racist. They are doing this to target Black people or other people of color. They still don't want to believe it, even though kind of the cover has come off and people are saying outrageous and blatant things in the street. And so in the situation with Sandridge, for example, there is example after example where we can point to decisions that were made to target the Black community and spare the white community. And the excuse is, well, that land is cheaper. And then a judge will say that that's the end of the story, and we don't get behind why is that land cheaper? What did you do? How did the intentional discrimination lead to the devaluation of Black land? In one case that I looked at in Nashville, where I-40, literally takes this big loop and cuts through a Black community and spares a white community, there was evidence after evidence that it was intentional, that they had a hearing but told the Black community the wrong day and the wrong time for the hearing, that they had given members of the Black community a different set of plans and said, these are some of the plans we're considering, when they knew that they had already decided on the route that went through their community. And the judge accepted that as not, it said it was not evidence of intentional discrimination. So unfortunately, it's hard to get people to accept that racism, intentional racial discrimination, is real, is powerful, and is still at play.
So another question, and then I promise I'll stop, is among the many things that I found really arresting in your book, I was struck, maybe as a white person myself, I was struck by white people's willingness to make decisions that arguably were against their own interests in order to perpetuate racial segregation and racial inequality. So you talked about example, the dead-end streets, right? The one-way streets, the voting against public transportation, right? That these are all things that arguably also reduced white people's mobility in addition to Black people's mobility. And so I just wanted to ask if you, does that tell us something about the nature of white supremacy in the United States, right?
Yes, and leave it there, right? Of course, right? Part of the challenge around challenging racism is getting people to understand that what they're doing is not in their own best interest. Some of it is, I'm willing to be inconvenienced as long as there is someone who is beneath me. And I will do whatever I have to do to keep those people beneath me, even if it adds time to my commute, even if it makes my life more difficult, even if we don't get policy that's going to help uplift me economically, I'll still be better than them. And so they're willing to support things that aren't in their own interest. Part of it, I also think, is that we just are used to what we're used to, right? In some instances, we just don't know any better. We believe the narrative that a wider highway is going to reduce traffic and help us get to where we want to go more quickly, that bike lanes are going to inhibit us, and we don't know any better. And that's true about folks in, white folks and Black folks. I spent some time with the folks in Indianapolis, and that I-65, I-70 interchange it is also up for reconstruction, reimagining. And in the beginning, they showed Black folks the plans for redeveloping that interchange. And it was going to widen it and be more destructive, take more homes. And they looked at the plans and they were like, okay, it looks like what we have. We're used to it. And you all say it's necessary. And that's how we get around. We get around by cars on the highways. And so that's all fine. And what it took was that there were some city planners and an architect who lived in the impacted community and said, let me draw a new set of plans that's going to really help you visualize what this is going to do to your homes and your community. And when they saw the alternative plans, they were like, oh, hell no, right? And then they rallied and started to fight the development. And on top of that, they got lots of pro bono services, people who helped them do alternative air quality studies, people who helped them draw up alternative plans that help protect their community and made it more visually pleasing. And then did studies that showed that that wasn't going to decrease efficiency, it wasn't going to increase costs. Gave them the tools so that they could fight, so they can reimagine, right? Because we only know what we know. And giving the community the tools to help imagine a different possibility and the tools to fight for that possibility made a difference. So part of it, I think, is education for all of us, to understanding the history, to understanding the impact, and to understanding the possibilities.
Great. So now we get to the cold call portion of today's session. So I want to start. We have some great questions submitted by professors and students.
Do the student ones. The professor ones are going to be too. I know y'all. I ask the same kind of
I'm
question.
starting with a professor. So Professor Janelle George.
All right, Janelle.
I can ask your question for you if you want.
Remember my question.
Okay.
You can ask it.
You can take the mic in case you want to elaborate.
Sure.
So
Okay.
the question was, what can be done now, particularly in a polarizing political climate, to address the harm imposed on so many families by the building of highways and destruction of many Black neighborhoods? So you don't have a set of policy prescriptions in the book, but what you've thought about this,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
I certainly have. I'm continuing to do this work. I think right now I represent about 5 communities around the country that are fighting predatory infrastructure plans. So there's still so much that we can do. We had a period where the federal government was focused on this work, where we're advancing a conversation around the impact of transportation infrastructure, talking about the racism in the highways, helping to build tools. They were focused in the infrastructure bill on rebuilding communities and weaving them back together. All that's gone now. We don't have those tools. We used to have folks within the Department of Transportation that were open to Title VI complaints and doing investigations and trying to mediate the harm. That's really not an option anymore either, but it doesn't mean we are without tools. There are powerful laws at the state level that people should be thinking about and people should be using. There are local laws that require participation and engagement, and we should be fighting and using those tools. I think based on the example that I just gave, one of the most important things we can do is to give communities the tools that they need to engage on the same playing field, to give them the technical support that they need so that they can be a part of the conversation, right? Because there's only so much we can do to fight the decision once it's already been made. I hope that we can lean into tools that help us get at the beginning of that conversation and make people a part of that conversation from the very beginning. And then I want to encourage us to think creatively, right? We're lawyers, to think creatively about the tools that we use to fight predatory and discriminatory infrastructure projects. Too often we lean into the Title VI's and the equal protections of the world. And I'm looking at Professor Rothstein. Her son and I are co-counsel in a couple of cases. In one case, we represent a community in Illinois where they have had their water infrastructure neglected. It's a predominantly Black community, surrounded by a white county. The white county government has given all kinds of resources for water infrastructure to the county, but not to this Black town in the middle of it. And it's been so degraded that at this point, if it rains for 5 minutes, the community floods. The streets fill with raw sewage. People's homes fill with raw sewage. Feces are baked into their walls, because it's happened so often. And rather than fix it, when it flooded a few years ago, the federal government said, we're just going to declare you a disaster area and we're going to buy your houses. And the county said, great. We're going to buy the houses. We're not going to fix them. We'll buy your house and we'll tear it down so we don't have to fix the water infrastructure. They were offering these people $5,000 for their house, right? So they were going to turn a community of Black homeowners into a community of Black renters who couldn't even afford to rent in their community. And so what we were able to do with some success, one cause of action was a takings action. And takings law hasn't been used in this way, but what the county did was to take the property of these people. Another cause of action we were pursuing is nuisance, right? Public nuisance law is more robust. There's so many areas of law that were developed outside of the gaze of racial justice, and so they're more robust and the language is more kind of generous to plaintiffs, and that we need to think about how to use these laws that have been used in this context before to advance the cause of Black communities.
Thank you. So I know you're here to talk about highways and sidewalks and air-conditioned bus stops.
You're going to ask me about the ACLU?
Well, a couple of our students are interested in asking you.
Okay.
So is Demir Arthur here? Demir, are you here? Maybe don't want to. Well, I'll ask Demir's question then. The question is, how do you navigate the tension between preserving the ACLU's longstanding commitment to universal civil liberties and addressing the unique and urgent needs of marginalized communities who have historically been excluded from those very liberties?
Yeah. So I think that's a balance we have been trying to strike since the very beginning for 105 years now. The ACLU is committed to defending the Constitution for everyone, to protect everyone's civil rights and civil liberties. And so we will represent people who we don't agree with and vehemently disagree with if we think that important civil rights or civil liberties principles are at stake. And of course, that happens very frequently in the First Amendment context. But we've also always kind of risen to the challenge of the day and focused on particular areas of civil liberties or civil rights that were at threat. So, thinking about after 9/11, where we were very focused on religious freedom and national security, and kind of putting extra resources in that context. After the Shelby decision, very focused on voting rights. Today, focused on a whole host of other things, right? A long list. But part of it is thinking about how do we continue to do all the work that we need to do, but also responding to a crisis. I think that we often get the critique that we are not focused on the broader civil rights or civil liberties principle because we are representing folks in the most marginalized communities. We are constantly, in the last 5 years, get a critique that we are not focused on the First Amendment anymore, that we don't do First Amendment work. When in fact we do. We do an incredible amount of First Amendment work. I think part of that, for some people, is a response to me and this idea that because, and this has been literally said to me, because I'm there, the ACLU only cares about race now, which is not true. We've always been a racial justice organization. Thurgood Marshall was on our board before he joined the court, but also on who we represent. So people see our First Amendment work as representing folks engaged in hate speech, representing the Klan or the Nazis, and that's what they see as First Amendment work. And they're less willing to see representing professors of color who have been targeted for their scholarship or their speech, or activists who have been targeted as First Amendment work, even though it is. And so in some respects, that work is the most important now because they don't have the resources to fight and they are being targeted. So I really do think that we try to defend the basic principle, making sure that everyone has access to their rights, but also know that we need to respond to where there is crisis, because where there is crisis is where the threats to foundational principles around civil liberties and civil rights are most acute.
So a student has a follow-on question. It's
The same student wrote a question.
No. It's a different student. This is a different student who asked a question that does connect nicely to what you were just talking about. So Camille Young, are you here, Camille? Boy, we are really having a problem.
A bunch of folks had to leave after the talk was done.
I guess so. Or maybe they knew that I'd highlighted them on my list and they're like, I'm out of here. So Camille's question was, how has your identity as a Black woman shaped the way you lead the ACLU? What is your vision and your goals for the future of the ACLU in ways that protect our rights in a time of changing legal precedent?
Yeah. So I don't. It's hard. That's a complicated. It should be an easy question to answer. It's not, because so many things are running through my head. I think being a person of color, being a Black woman in this role, there are lots of expectations on me of who I will be in this role and what I will do. So many people who I don't know, have never met, who wish me well, who say that they're proud of me, who they're excited to see where I'm going to take the organization. But an equal number of people will reach out to me and say that because I am who I am, I'm going to destroy the organization, that I'm going to take the organization in a way that is not true to who who the organization is and what it should be. And so either I have to live up to those expectations and make sure that I continue to make the people who said they were proud of me proud, or to crush the expectations of the people who think that because I'm a Black woman, I'm going to drive this organization into the ground. I think that I bring to this work the reason why I do this work, right? I came to this work for very deeply personal reasons. I am the first person in my family to graduate from college. I'm a first-generation American citizen, grew up in Connecticut, in a community where my parents had to navigate incredible and intense
racism and discrimination because they were Black, because they spoke with an accent, because they weren't American citizens, because they struggled financially. In the book, in the introduction, I talk about an experience after my family was able to move from a segregated community in Hartford, Connecticut, that was predominantly Black and Latino, to Windsor, Connecticut, which is a mostly white suburb at the time. We were one of 3 Black families to move into that community, and the community used every opportunity to let us know that we weren't wanted, and woke up one day to find that our house had been vandalized and KKK had been spray painted on our house and our car. And my parents had to explain to me why our neighbors didn't want us there, what the KKK was, and talk about racism. And I felt like since that day, I was very acutely aware of the way that racism helped shape my life and helped limit access to opportunities, to limit my space, made me think that things weren't possible, right? Because racism and sexism and ableism and all those things work in part by convincing you that you don't belong, that you should be outside of opportunity, and getting you to voluntarily shrink yourself, to not take up space. And so I bring to my own personal work every single day this idea that I want to fight to make sure that we're opening access to opportunity, to fight for people like me and families like mine, and to protect their ability to live with dignity and respect, and to have access to a choice-filled life, to be able to make good choices because they have good choices to make. And I try to bring that work to the ACLU, to make sure that we are thinking always about the most marginalized in communities, the way that our systems have denied access to opportunity, the way that we can have rights on the books, but because of the way our other systems operate, those rights are less meaningful, though they're less accessible. I want to make sure that it's not just about the work that we do, but how we do that work and who does that work. So making sure that the organization looks like America in all the ways that it should, that people who have been impacted by the work are doing the work, are shaping the work, and are leading the organization. People often say that the ACLU is, what people often say to me is that it's a white legacy organization. And the ACLU is far more diverse than I think folks recognize in every measure of diversity. But if you look at racial diversity, you have me as the president and an out gay Puerto Rican man as executive director. Our board is 60% people of color. We are just an incredibly diverse organization, and I think it impacts the way that we do racial justice work. It impacts the way we do policing. It impacts the way we do disability rights work and gender equity work. It impacts our LGBTQ work. It impacts our First Amendment work. And I think that's important. I have very much tried to lean into that, to making sure that we do the work that we need to do. The people doing the work are the people who need to be doing the work, and we're doing it in a way that respects communities, their autonomy, and that they know what's good for them. They don't need us to come in and tell them what is good for them. They need us to support them in that fight.
I think we can take a couple more minutes if folks who want to ask a question live. I won't be cold calling. Now the volunteer portion of our. Yeah, can we get a mic over here for Professor Catino?
Hi, I'm Nikita Catino. This was amazing. And you've probably had this question before, but I'm curious what work gentrification does in the transportation sort of issue, and the way in which now sort of the white communities are now entering into once minority communities. How does that sort of reverse transportation impact the transportation question?
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick because it's kind of layered. I didn't say this when I was telling the story of Indianapolis, but the reason why there were these architects and city planners living in this community was because of gentrification. Those were white folks who had come to the community and were, because of that gentrification, were able to be there to help fight for their own community and the people who live there. And so gentrification is certainly a big part of why some communities are seeing success in fighting infrastructure projects, is because those communities are more diverse than they were before. We are seeing challenges around the reverse migration piece that you mentioned. white folks moving into the cities, displacing Black and brown folks who have lived there, who have now had to move out to the suburbs, and having suburbs that aren't built for those folks because folks lack cars. Black and brown people disproportionately don't own cars. It's not connected to public transportation, no subway stops. They don't have bus stops there. And so it is creating difficulty for those communities who are now being pushed farther and farther out, away from usable transportation infrastructure. And one other challenge I'll say that's connected to gentrification is displacement around new projects. So even when we're seeing the best of intentions and we're having economic investment in formerly deprived communities, when we're thinking about how to reimagine the highway, people are tearing it down and building a street grid, or capping the highway, or embedding the highway, and it comes with economic investment. That economic investment is leading to displacement, forced displacement of the people who had rebuilt their lives in the shadow of that highway. And so as we're doing those projects, we have to think about gentrification, we have to think about forced displacement, and do this in a way where there is long-term investment in the stability of that community and individuals, so that they can continue to afford to live there, so that homeowners don't have the taxes go so high that they can't afford their homes, so that renters who have lived there for 20 years are now forced to move because they can't afford the rent, or that businesses, mom and pop shops who have been there for decades, aren't forced out by big box stores that come in. So we have to think about the role that gentrification can play following in community investment in the transportation infrastructure that will further displace folks who've been living there.
Maybe time for one more question. We have a volunteer.
I see there's a few.
We'll go to the other side of the room.
Thank you so much for sharing, Professor Titilayo Ali. I feel like I have to speak up for Atlanta.
Before you ask your question, I see that Steve Bright is leaving. And I just want to acknowledge Steve. I know, I saw. And Steve was one of my professors when I was in law school. And I just love him dearly and have always valued him. Thank you.
You are absolutely right about everything you said.
Can you come tell my children that?
I will, happy to. As you alluded to, there have been some recent efforts to maybe not overtly address what's happened, but in some ways address it. So it's called the Big Stitch now in Atlanta. I think there was a similar project in Boston to sort of restitch some of these areas, but there hasn't been an explicit discussion of the racial intent behind the creation. So I'm curious if, as you think about these more recent projects to address some of those efforts, any thoughts on, one, like successes in that area, and two, how and if you can effectively address it without explicitly discussing how it got there and why?
I really appreciate that question. So it's so important for us to have honest conversations about where we are and how we got here, and that is something that we're seeing a lot of pushback. When Secretary Buttigieg started to elevate the conversation, I appreciated it because people were starting to have a conversation about how things got the way they got to be this way. We think that it's just natural and inevitable that there are good communities and bad communities, and we don't think about what we did to create those communities. And the conversation about how we got here is incredibly important because it helps us understand why the reparations or repair or investment is necessary, right? Either you believe, to think about it in the education context, either you believe in the worst stereotypes about Black and brown families and kids, that we don't value education, that parents don't love their kids, that we don't want to invest in our communities, or you believe our system is deeply broken. And one way to help you understand if it's A or B is to understand the history about the lack of investment in public education in Black and brown communities. Either you believe that people who live in Black and brown communities don't care about their homes, they don't want to invest in their communities, that they're not enterprising, and they don't want to get to jobs, they want to just stay home and not work, or you believe that we have built their neighborhoods in ways that keep them from accessing opportunity. And one way to help you understand that we have built their neighborhood in a way to keep them from accessing opportunity is to tell the stories of how we built their communities to keep them from accessing opportunity. So I believe that the story has to be a part of the repair, that it's not real repair if we don't understand why it happened, because then we'll just repeat the same sins again. But the work can't end by telling the story. I talked to a woman who's an organizer in Indianapolis named Paula, and she was like, I don't need any more monuments or plaques that say bad things happen here. I need you to tell the story that the bad things happen here and tell me what you are going to do to fix it. And so I think the narrative has to be an important part of that. Indianapolis is doing that. There's a website of an organization's called the Rethink Coalition, and they have a website that's trying to do all the things. They're telling the history of how the highway destroyed downtown Indianapolis, certain communities, showing pictures and showing documents that prove that this happened and it was intentional. They're talking about the impact that it had, connecting that impact to what we see today, but then saying, and here's how we can fix it, and here's what we're going to do, and here's the tools we're going to use to do that. We have to tell the stories. A quick other side, I work with the ACLU in Southern California. They're supporting a community in Watts that wants to make a street safer because they're losing a lot of community members and neighbors on that street because cars are racing down it with no regard for the people who live there. And they want to fix it in a way that doesn't bring police in, that doesn't invite police. So they don't want a stoplight, they don't want a stop sign because that brings police in. They learned through support that planting trees will slow traffic. Planting green along the roadway will slow traffic. Building art. And bringing in the history piece, they also learned that there used to be trees in that neighborhood, but the trees were cut down at the request of the LAPD because they were inhibiting surveillance from the helicopters. And that's an important part of the story that helps us understand how that community got there and why we owe something to that community to help them fix it.
Well, thank you, Deborah. I could continue this conversation all night, but I just want to point out that Professor Archer has a plane to catch in a couple of hours because she's leaving for Italy tomorrow, a trip she delayed in order to be able to come here to be with us tonight. So for that reason and everything else, a huge, warm thank you to you.